Hello friends, we're in Leviticus chapter 13 and we're going to read chapter 13 and 14. Serious skin diseases is chapter 13, and in a lot of versions of the Bible it says leprosy, which is a very dangerous skin disease. It's not something that we face in the United States really today, but often leprosy or this serious skin disease is a reflection of sin. And I think that's something good to keep in mind as I read this passage, because sin can spread very quickly. So just like a skin disease can start off looking very, very small and spread and have very disastrous effects, so can sin. So chapter 13 of Leviticus, I'm reading out of the NLT. And even though I'm saying that, obviously the most important thing is to just focus on the word of scripture and let your time with God reveal things to you as you feel like is happening when you're just spending time in the Word of God. So, chapter 13 of Leviticus. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, if anyone has a swelling or a rash or discolored skin that might develop into a serious skin disease or leprosy, that person must be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons. The priest will examine the affected area of the skin. If the hair in the affected area has turned white and the problem appears to be more than skin deep, it is a serious skin disease, and the priest who examines it must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean. But if the affected area of the skin is only a white discoloration and does not appear to be more than skin deep, and if the hair on the spot has not turned white, the priest will quarantine the person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest will make another examination. If he finds the affected area has not changed and the problem has not spread on the skin, the priest will quarantine the person for 7 more days. On the 7th day, the priest will make another examination. If he finds the affected area has faded and is not spread, the priest will pronounce the person ceremonially clean. It was only a rash. The person's clothing must be washed and the person will be ceremonially clean. But if the rash continues to spread and the person has been examined by the priest and has been pronounced clean, the infected person must return to be examined again. See the reflection there with sin, how it might seem serious, it might not, you never know. You've got to keep checking on it, you've got to keep bringing it to the Lord, you've got to keep praying over it, and you've got to continue to face the situation. If the priest finds that the rash has spread, he must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean, for it is indeed a skin disease or leprosy. Anyone who develops a serious skin disease must go to the priest for an examination. If the priest finds a white swelling on the skin and some hair on the spot has turned white, and there is an open sore in the affected area, it is a chronic skin disease, and the priest must pronounce this person ceremonially unclean. In such cases, the person need not to be quarantined, for it is obvious that the skin is defiled by the disease. Now suppose the disease has spread all over the person's skin, covering the body from head to foot. When the priest examines the infected person and finds that the disease covers the entire body, he will pronounce the person ceremonially clean. Since the skin has turned completely white, the person is clean. But if any open sore appears, the infected person will be pronounced ceremonially unclean. The priest must make this pronouncement as soon as he sees an open sore, since open sores indicate the presence of a skin disease. However, if the open sores heal and turn white like the rest of the skin, the person must return to the priest for another examination. If the affected areas have indeed turned white, the priest will then pronounce the person ceremonially clean by declaring you are clean. If anyone has a boil on the skin that has started to heal, but a white swelling or reddish white spot develops in the place, the person must go to the priest to be examined. If the priest examines it and finds it to be more than skin deep, and if the hair is affected, the priest examines it and finds it to be more than skin deep, the area has turned white, the priest must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean. The boil has become a serious skin disease. But if the priest finds no white hair on the affected area, and the problem appears to be no more than skin deep and has faded, the priest must quarantine the person for 7 days. If during that time the affected area spreads on the skin, the priest must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean. because it is a serious disease. But if the area grows no larger and does not spread, it is merely the scar from the boil, and the priest will pronounce the person ceremonially clean. If anyone has suffered a burn on the skin and the burned area changes color, becoming either reddish, white, or shiny white, the priest must examine it. If he finds that the hair in the affected area has turned white and the problem appears to be more than skin deep, a skin disease has broken out in the burn. The priest must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean, for it is clearly a serious skin disease. But if the priest finds no white hair on the affected area and the problem appears no more than skin deep and has faded, the priest must quarantine the infected person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest must examine the person again. If the affected area has spread on the skin, the priest must pronounce that person ceremonially unclean, for it is clearly a serious skin disease. But if the affected area has not changed or spread on the skin that has faded, it is simply a swelling from the burn. The priest will pronounce the person ceremonially clean, for it is only a scar from the burn. If anyone, either a man or woman, has a sore on the head or chin, the priest must examine it. If he finds it is more than skin deep and has fine yellow hair on it, the priest must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean. It is a scabby sore on the head or chin. If the priest examines the scabby sore and finds that it is only skin deep but there is no black hair on it, he must quarantine the person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest must examine the sore again. If he finds that the scabby sore has not been spread and there is no yellow hair on it, and it appears to be only skin deep, the person must shave off all the hair except the hair on the affected area. Then the priest must quarantine the person for another 7 days. On the 7th day, he will examine the sore again. If it has not spread and appears to be no more than skin deep, the priest will pronounce the person ceremonially clean. The person's clothing must be washed and the person will be ceremonially clean. But if the scabby sore begins to spread after the person is pronounced clean, the priest must do another examination. See how serious this is? Very tedious. I cannot believe this. If he finds the sore has spread, the priest does not need to look for yellow hair. The infected person is ceremonially unclean. But if the color of the scabby sore does not change and black hair has grown on it, it has healed. The priest will then pronounce the person ceremonially clean. If anyone, either a man or woman, has shiny white patches on the skin, the priest must examine the affected area. If he finds that the shiny patches are only pale white, this is a harmless skin rash, and the person is ceremonially clean. If a man loses his hair and his head becomes bald, he is still ceremonially clean. No big deal. And if he loses hair on his forehead, he simply has a bald forehead. He is still clean. No problem. However, if a reddish white sore appears on the bald area on top of his head or on his forehead, this is a serious skin disease. This priest must examine him, and if he finds swelling around the reddish white sore anywhere on the man's head and it looks like a skin disease, the man is indeed infected with a skin disease and is unclean. The priest must pronounce him ceremonially unclean because of the sore on his head. Those who suffer from a serious skin disease must tear their clothing and leave their hair uncombed. They must cover their mouth and call out, "Unclean, unclean, unclean." As soon as the serious disease lasts, as long as the serious disease lasts, they will be ceremonially unclean. They must live in isolation in their place outside the camp, all revealing the seriousness of sin. Anytime sin is starting to show itself in your life, you need to face it. You need to cut it off. And I think back in the Old Testament when Leviticus was written, they didn't want any of this to be affecting the population of Israel. Now suppose mildew contaminates some woolen or linen clothing, woolen or linen fabric, and the hide of an animal, or anything made of leather. If the contaminated area in the clothing, the animal hide, fabric, the leather article has turned greenish or reddish, it is contaminated with mildew and must be shown to the priest. After examining the affected spot, the priest will put the article in quarantine for 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest must inspect it again. If the contaminated area has spread, the clothing or fabric or leather is clearly contaminated by a serious mildew and is ceremonially unclean. The priest must burn the item, the clothing, the woolen or linen fabric or piece of leather, for it has been contaminated by a serious mildew. It must be completely destroyed by fire. But if the priest examines it and finds the contaminated area has not spread in the clothing, the fabric, or the leather, the priest will order the object to be washed in the quarantine for 7 more days. Then the priest must examine the object again. If he finds that the contaminated area has not changed color after being washed, even if it did not spread, the object is defiled. It must be completely burned up, whether the contaminated spot is on the inside or on the outside. But if the priest examines it and finds that the contaminated area has faded after being washed, he must cut the spot from the clothing, the fabric, or the leather. If the spot later reappears on the clothing, the fabric, or the leather article, the mildew is clearly spreading and the contaminated object must be burned up. But if the spot disappears from the clothing, the fabric, or the leather article after it's been washed, it must be washed again. Then it will be ceremonially clean. These are the instructions for dealing with mildew that contaminates woolen or linen clothing or fabric or anything made of leather. This is how the priest determines whether these items are ceremonially clean or unclean. Woo, these are longer chapters, so stick with me. Let's try 14. Cleansing from skin disease. And the Lord said to Moses, the following instructions are for those seeking ceremonial purification from a skin disease. Those who have been healed must be brought to the priest, who will examine them at a place outside the camp. If the priest finds that someone has been healed of a serious skin disease, he will perform a purification ceremony using 2 live birds that are ceremonially clean, a stick of cedar, some scarlet yarn, and a hyssop branch. The priest will order that 1 bird be slaughtered over a clay pot filled with water. He will take the live bird, the cedar stick, the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop branch, and dip them into the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over the fresh water. The priest will then sprinkle the blood of the dead bird 7 times on the person being purified of the skin disease. When the priest has purified the person, he will release the live bird in the open field to fly away. The person being purified must then wash their clothes, shave off all their hair, and bathe themselves in water. Then they will be ceremonially clean and may return to the camp. However, they must remain outside their tents for 7 days. On the 7th day, they must again shave off all their hair from their heads, including the hair of the beard and eyebrows. They must also wash their clothes and bathe themselves in water. Then they will be ceremonially clean. It's a good thing you don't have to do that when you sin today. On the 8th day, each person being purified must bring 2 male lambs and a 1-year-old female lamb, all with no defects, along with a grain offering of 6 quarts of choice flour moistened with olive oil and a cup of olive oil. When the officiating priest presents that person for purification along with the offerings before the Lord at the entrance of the tabernacle, the priest will take 1 of the male lambs and the olive oil and present them as a guilt offering, lifting them up as a special offering before the Lord. He will then slaughter the male lamb in a sacred area where sin offerings and burnt offerings are slaughtered. As with the sin offering, the guilt offering belongs to the priest. It is most holy. It is the most holy offering. The priest will then take some of the blood of the guilt offering and apply it to the lobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot of the person being purified. Then the priest will pour some of the olive oil into the palm of his own left hand. He will dip his right finger into the oil in his palm and sprinkle some of it with his finger 7 times before the Lord. The priest will then apply some of the oil in his palm before the blood from the guilt offering and that is on the lobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot of the person being purified. The priest will apply the oil remaining in his hand to the head of the person being purified. So much going on. Through this process, the priest will purify the person before the Lord. Then the priest must present the sin offering to purify the person who has been cured of the skin disease. After that, the priest will slaughter the burnt offering and offer it on the altar along with the grain offering. Through this process, the priest will purify the person who was healed, and the person will be ceremonially clean. But anyone who is too poor and cannot afford these offerings may bring one male lamb for a guilt offering to be lifted up as a special offering for purification. The person must also bring 2 quarts of choice flour moistened with olive oil for a grain offering and a cup of olive oil. The offering must also include 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, whichever the person can afford. One of the pair must be used for the sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. On the 8th day of the purification ceremony, the person being purified must bring the offering to the priest in the Lord's presence at the entrance of the tabernacle. The priest will take the lamb for the guilt offering along with the olive oil and lift them up as a special offering to the Lord. Then the priest will slaughter the lamb for the guilt offering. He will take some of its blood and apply it to the lobe of the right ear, the thumb of the right hand, and the big toe of the right foot of the person being purified. And that's Leviticus 14 to 25. We're going to pause and finish up 14:26 in the next video, so stay tuned.